In the quiet village of Leone, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, the air carried both the scent of blooming flowers and the weight of whispered secrets. The villagers went about their lives with careful routines, tending to their crops, trading at the market, and maintaining the delicate balance of their community. Yet, at the edge of the village, in a sprawling house with weathered stone walls and tall, narrow windows, a different story unfolded, one hidden behind closed doors and heavy curtains, a story of shadows and suppressed light. This was the home of Ayana, a young girl whose bright eyes and gentle laughter had once illuminated every corner of her mother's household. Her mother, a kind and nurturing woman, had passed when Ayana was still very young, leaving her at the mercy of a woman who wore the guise of care but bore the heart of cruelty, her stepmother. From the very first day of her arrival, the stepmother, a woman named Morana, set out to assert her dominance. Morana's demeanor was sharp and calculating, her words like icy gusts that pierced the warmth of Ayana's spirit. She regarded the girl not as a child to nurture, but as an inconvenience, a reminder of a life she could never claim, and a symbol of affection she had never received. Each morning, Ayana would awaken to the cold glare of Morana's eyes, sensing immediately that any small act of joy or kindness would be met with disapproval, punishment, or a dismissive scowl. The household, once filled with the tender echoes of maternal care, now resonated with the quiet fear instilled by Morana's constant presence. Morana's cruelty was subtle at first, a seemingly innocent word or gesture meant to diminish Ayana's confidence. She would mock Ayana's attempts at drawing, singing, or learning new skills, framing her talents as trivial or foolish. When Ayana tried to speak of her feelings, she was silenced with sharp words or an unrelenting glare that made her retreat inward, questioning the worth of her own voice. The girl's meals were meager, her chores endless, and her rest minimal. Every day, Morana found new ways to isolate Ayana, keeping her from the company of other children in the village, forbidding her from visiting friends, and assigning her the most grueling tasks within the household. The girl's world, once full of wonder and curiosity, narrowed to the small, confining spaces Morana allowed her to occupy. Yet, despite the oppressive atmosphere, Ayana's spirit refused to fully extinguish. In fleeting moments, she would catch glimpses of her own resilience, a stubborn hope in her heart, a fleeting spark of defiance in her gaze, a quiet rebellion that manifested in whispered thoughts no one could hear. The villagers, aware of the stepmother's harshness, often cast sympathetic glances as Ayana passed by, yet fear and respect for Morana kept them from intervening. Inside the house, shadows lengthened, and the contrast between the girl's inner light and her stepmother's darkness grew ever starker. Each day of isolation, each cutting word, each small humiliation was designed to break her, yet unknowingly, it began to shape her, teaching patience, resilience, and a silent understanding that the strength to endure could one day transform into power. In the House of Shadows, Ayana's spirit was challenged, but the foundations of her eventual vengeance were quietly taking root. Each morning in the House of Shadows began with a ritual of subtle torment for Ayana. The rooster's crow was a cruel herald, signaling the start of another day filled with endless chores, strict scrutiny, and the constant threat of punishment. From the moment she opened her eyes, Ayana was met with a barrage of commands: sweep the floors until they gleamed, scrub the stone steps until her hands bled, fetch water from the well before sunrise, and prepare the meals with precision that would satisfy her stepmother's impossible standards. No task was ever enough. Morana's eyes constantly roamed, sharp and judging, ready to find fault in the smallest mistake. The girl learned to move quietly, to anticipate every whim and caprice, but no matter how carefully she performed, the words of scorn were never far behind. Morana's cruelty was not always direct. Often, it came wrapped in manipulation and subtle degradation. She would command the other servants and Ayana's step-siblings to treat her with disdain, whispering lies about her worthlessness and exaggerating every misstep. "Do not listen to her," Morana would say to the younger children, her voice sweet but laced with venom. "She is lazy and ungrateful. Do you see how weak she is?" The household soon became a theater of silent cruelty, where the young girl was constantly watched, judged, and isolated. Even meals, a basic human necessity, became instruments of power. Morana would serve the girl last, offering scraps while others ate heartily, and force her to watch the abundance of others as a reminder of her lowly place. Ayana's attempts to speak up were met with immediate rebuke. Her words were twisted or ignored, and sometimes her stepmother would invent new punishments, sending her to the cold cellar for imagined slights, or assigning menial tasks designed to humiliate rather than aid. Servants, fearful of Morana's wrath, complied willingly with these schemes. Even her step-siblings, trained by years of observation and fear, became unwilling instruments of cruelty, mocking her clumsiness or reporting every minor error. Loneliness enveloped Ayana like a thick fog. Her only companions were fleeting shadows, the sound of her own heartbeat, and the quiet moments when she dared to imagine a different life. Yet, within that oppressive solitude, her mind remained alert, quietly observing, memorizing, and understanding the patterns of those who sought to control her. Though Ayana's body was weary and her eyes often downcast, there were moments when sparks of defiance emerged. A slight delay in obeying an unfair order, a subtle act of kindness toward a cowering servant, or a fleeting glance that challenged the rules, these small rebellions, almost invisible, were the beginnings of a spirit that refused total submission. Inside, she nurtured a private garden of thoughts and strategies, imagining ways she might one day turn the tables. The very cruelty that sought to extinguish her light was instead strengthening the roots of her resolve. Every insult, every deprivation, every manipulative trap was an unintentional teacher, instructing her in patience, observation, and endurance. By the end of each day, Ayana's body ached, and her spirit seemed bowed under the weight of relentless oppression, yet the faint glow of determination never vanished. She learned to mask her strength beneath apparent fragility, to appear broken while her mind sharpened. The House of Shadows was meant to crush her, but in reality, it was shaping her into something far greater than her stepmother ever imagined. In every whispered insult, in every cold glance and unkind task, Ayana's inner fire grew stronger, preparing her for the moment when patience and cunning would combine to reclaim her dignity and deliver justice in a form that would be unforgettable. In the long hours of isolation imposed by her stepmother, Ayana began to notice the sharpness of her own senses, a clarity that had been honed through constant vigilance. Forced to navigate a household rife with cruelty, she had learned to read the subtlest expressions, the quietest shifts of posture, and the unspoken intentions in the tone of every word. Every glance, every whisper, and every gesture became a clue, a piece of a puzzle that revealed not only the cruelty of her stepmother but also the vulnerabilities hidden within those who sought to dominate her. She realized that what had once seemed like mere suffering could be transformed into knowledge, a secret strength cultivated by observation, patience, and the careful recording of details in her mind. Ayana began to explore this skill deliberately. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the house was still and her stepmother slept, she would watch and memorize the routines of everyone around her. She learned which servants were sympathetic, which rooms had hidden nooks, which keys opened doors that were meant to remain locked, and how to move without attracting notice. Every chore, once a burden meant to break her spirit, became an exercise in precision and awareness. Her hands, once trembling with exhaustion, grew deft and capable, able to perform her work efficiently while observing everything around her. Even simple acts, sweeping a floor or filling a water pail, became lessons in patience, timing, and silent communication. Beyond observation, Ayana discovered a talent for storytelling. Initially, it was a means to soothe herself during long, lonely nights, to breathe life into the dull darkness of her room. She invented tales of brave girls and cunning heroes, stories where the oppressed triumphed through wit, courage, and clever planning. Slowly, she began sharing these stories in whispered tones with those servants who were discreetly loyal, embedding within them lessons of resilience and hope. Through storytelling, Ayana realized she could influence the thoughts and emotions of others, planting seeds of inspiration, courage, and subtle rebellion. She discovered that words, even when spoken softly, carried a power that was almost magical, shaping perception and quietly altering behavior. The stepmother, preoccupied with outward appearances and her own schemes, remained oblivious to the quiet transformation taking place. Ayana's secret practice extended beyond observation and storytelling. She experimented with minor crafts, fashioning small objects in the hidden corners of the house, charms, trinkets, and even protective amulets, weaving her intent and hope into each creation. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced her belief in her own abilities. The more she practiced, the more confident she became, aware that her inner resources, intellect, creativity, empathy, and resilience, were far more formidable than anyone had suspected. Subtle foreshadowing began to manifest in her growing control over her surroundings. Doors she had studied for months opened silently beneath her touch. Objects would occasionally move just as she intended, unnoticed by others. Small acts of protection and misdirection allowed her to shield herself and those quietly loyal to her without alerting the stepmother. Every day her power grew in hidden increments, a silent current that promised a future reckoning. In this secret cultivation, Ayana learned the most important truth. True strength need not be loud or overt. It could be patient, deliberate, and hidden. A force that waits until the perfect moment to reveal itself in full. Each cruel word and punishing task had unintentionally honed her skills and sharpened her mind. The house that had been built to contain and diminish her became the training ground for her eventual triumph. The girl who had seemed fragile and submissive was quietly becoming a force capable of turning oppression into opportunity, pain into precision, and whispered defiance into a power that could not be ignored. The seeds of vengeance, resilience, and strategic mastery were firmly planted, promising that the shadows of her stepmother's tyranny would one day give rise to a reckoning both inevitable and magnificent. In the stillness of her hidden moments, Ayana began to hear echoes of the past. At first, they were faint, fragments of old lullabies, the rustle of letters hidden in dusty corners, and whispers carried on the wind through the open windows of her childhood home. Curiosity led her to explore these remnants, and she soon uncovered the story of her mother, a woman of remarkable courage and unyielding spirit. Through old journals, carefully preserved mementos, and tales told in hushed tones by the few loyal servants who remembered, Ayana pieced together the life of a woman who had faced betrayal, hardship, and cruelty, yet had never allowed fear to dominate her. Her mother's words, written with both love and defiance, spoke of the strength that comes not from power over others but from mastery over oneself. They told of times when the household had sought to crush her spirit, and yet she had found ways to resist quietly, preserving her dignity and protecting those weaker than herself. Each story revealed a lineage of women who had endured suffering, transformed pain into wisdom, and wielded resilience as both shield and sword. Ayana realized that her own struggle was not isolated. It was part of a larger continuum of courage passed down through generations. As she delved deeper, Ayana discovered her mother's private symbols of resistance. Small engravings hidden in the woodwork, secret knots in fabrics, subtle signs of rebellion that had gone unnoticed by the household. Each discovery felt like a message across time, a reminder that her mother's spirit lived within her. The courage that had once seemed distant or unattainable now felt tangible, flowing through her in quiet pulses. Ayana began to internalize these lessons, allowing them to shape her thoughts, her strategies, and her vision for the future. The stepmother's relentless cruelty, which had sought to isolate and diminish her, now served as a catalyst rather than a barrier. Every harsh word, every dismissive glance, and every imposed task only awakened Ayana's determination. The awareness of her ancestry, the proof of the strength and cleverness embedded in her blood, transformed her fear into focus. She no longer viewed her stepmother's attempts as victories but as challenges to be met with patience, cunning, and inner power. Ayana began to recognize patterns in her stepmother's behavior, seeing the ways in which control was exerted and where weaknesses in that control could be found. The legacy of the women before her became a template for resistance. The quiet resilience that had sustained her mother and ancestors now guided her own actions. Small, deliberate moves that built her confidence, protected her from harm, and prepared the way for future defiance. This connection to her lineage also reshaped her perception of herself. She was not merely a victim of circumstance, she was a descendant of formidable women whose spirits had been tested and proven. The knowledge imbued her with a sense of purpose, transforming her suffering into preparation. Each act of cruelty she endured became a rehearsal for mastery, each insult a spark that illuminated the path forward. By embracing the whispers of the past, Ayana discovered a power that was both ancient and immediate. It was a strength rooted in memory, resilience, and the unbroken chain of women who had faced oppression before her. Where the stepmother sought to silence her, Ayana now heard the chorus of generations, urging her forward, reminding her that the spirit of a woman determined to reclaim herself could never truly be broken. The girl who had once been coward and diminished was awakening, her resolve tempered by the wisdom and courage of those who had walked before her, ready to shape her destiny with the force of ancestral fire. Ayana had learned to move through the household like a shadow, quiet but ever observant, turning her skills of perception and hidden strength into tools of subtle rebellion. The first acts were small, almost imperceptible, a misplaced key here, a gently loosened thread there, a spoon swapped in the kitchen that ruined a carefully prepared dish. Each minor disruption was enough to frustrate her stepmother without leaving a trace, signaling to Ayana that her influence, though hidden, could ripple through the rigid order imposed by cruelty. These small victories brought her a deep, simmering satisfaction, strengthening her belief that she was not powerless, that even the smallest interventions could challenge the household's oppression. The servants, long accustomed to fear and obedience, began to notice these subtle changes. A tray that had once been delivered with trembling hands now arrived perfectly balanced. A locked cabinet found open without explanation, and carefully placed notes that guided sympathetic helpers to act discreetly. Whispers among the servants spoke of unseen hands, of a quiet force working for justice, though none dared name her openly. Ayana realized that her actions were not only reclaiming control over her environment but also planting seeds of hope and courage in those who had been too afraid to resist. Her quiet defiance became a network, a silent rebellion that flourished in the shadows of the household. With each small victory, Ayana's confidence grew. She began experimenting with bolder tactics, carefully observing her stepmother's routines and vulnerabilities. She would redirect her stepmother's commands, subtly manipulate the placement of objects, and create situations that exposed minor flaws in her authority. The stepmother's carefully maintained image of control began to falter, though she could not yet pinpoint the cause. Her increasing suspicion led to harsher punishments and more oppressive demands, but these acts of cruelty only reinforced Ayana's determination. Each attempt to break her spirit now served as fuel, sharpening her focus and deepening her resolve. Ayana's planning became more deliberate. She began mapping the household, noting which rooms and passages offered privacy, which servants were secretly loyal, and how information flowed between her stepmother and the family's allies. Every observation informed her strategies, allowing her to act with precision and foresight. She realized that true rebellion required patience and intelligence. Overt confrontation would be met with overwhelming force, but subtle manipulation and the exploitation of her stepmother's blind spots offered the promise of victory without immediate danger. At the same time, Ayana's inner life flourished. She drew strength from the lessons of her mother and ancestors, the whispers of courage and resilience echoing in her mind. She practiced control over her own emotions, turning fear into focus, anger into strategy, and sadness into resolve. The quiet power she had cultivated through observation, storytelling, and hidden skill was now being applied outwardly, reshaping her world with calculated precision. The stepmother, sensing a shift, increased her surveillance, scrutinizing every movement, command, and whisper. Yet with every attempt to tighten control, Ayana adapted, finding new ways to circumvent her oppression. She learned to anticipate her stepmother's strategies, turning them against her, and in doing so, she demonstrated the first signs of a power that could not be crushed by intimidation or cruelty. Through these early acts of rebellion, Ayana came to understand the essence of her strength. It was not in open confrontation but in subtle mastery, in the ability to influence outcomes without direct force, in turning the tools of oppression into instruments of change. Each victory, however minor, confirmed that her spirit was unbreakable, her mind keen, and her heart steadfast. The girl who had once seemed fragile and obedient was quietly becoming a force to be reckoned with, a force that promised in time to transform the household, challenge her stepmother, and reclaim the justice that had long been denied. The morning began with a tension that seemed heavier than usual, the kind of oppressive weight that signals a storm is coming. Ayana had already grown accustomed to her stepmother's cruelty, each day a carefully choreographed series of insults, demeaning chores, and small acts of intimidation. But this morning, the stepmother sought to humiliate her in front of the entire household and several visiting villagers. She was forced to kneel in the dirt, carrying a basket of spoiled food she had been commanded to collect, while the stepmother loudly proclaimed her incompetence, comparing her to the useless daughters of the weak. Laughter echoed through the courtyard, a cruel chorus meant to crush her spirit. For the first time, Ayana did not lower her gaze. As the words washed over her, something within her shifted. The familiar fear that had always accompanied her stepmother's dominance ignited into something else, a fierce, blazing resolve. She realized that her suffering had been a teacher, each act of cruelty a test of patience and cunning. Her spirit, long constrained by shame and fear, now surged with energy and purpose. The humiliation, instead of breaking her, became the spark that awakened the strength she had quietly nurtured in secret. Ayana stood slowly, her movements deliberate, almost regal in their calm defiance. The stepmother froze, confused by the sudden lack of submission. The laughter of the villagers faded as they sensed the shift, a quiet, potent force radiating from the girl who had once seemed fragile. Ayana's eyes met her stepmother's, not with anger alone, but with a precision of mind that suggested calculation and inevitable consequence. She understood in that moment that her power was not in brute force but in subtlety, strategy, and the courage to act decisively. The days that followed marked the beginning of a new chapter. Ayana no longer waited for opportunities, she created them. She began to take bold, calculated actions that undermined her stepmother's authority without direct confrontation. A misfiled ledger here, a subtly shifted kitchen schedule there, or carefully whispered instructions to sympathetic servants that led to small, frustrating errors in the stepmother's plans. Each act, though minor in isolation, accumulated into a network of disruption, and the household began to feel the effects of her intelligence and foresight. Ayana also began to protect herself more assertively. When the stepmother's verbal assaults grew sharper, she responded not with words but with measured glances, steady composure, and actions that revealed her growing confidence. The servants who had once been too fearful to offer her small comforts now found courage in her presence, discreetly assisting her, and even subtly participating in the quiet rebellion she was orchestrating. The household, once ruled by fear and oppression, now felt the tremors of change. Outside the walls of the household, the villagers began noticing unusual occurrences, the stepmother's schemes subtly failing, servants moving with uncharacteristic purpose, and a girl who no longer flinched before cruelty. Whispers spread that Ayana possessed an intelligence and courage that exceeded what was expected of someone in her position. Fear and respect mingled in the villagers' eyes. They began to see that the girl who had been beaten and demeaned was now a figure to be watched, one who could not be easily broken. As the stepmother escalated her attempts to reassert control, she encountered resistance in forms she could not anticipate. Ayana anticipated her moves, turning her own aggression into opportunities to reveal her cunning. Each attempt to humiliate or harm her only served to strengthen Ayana's resolve and sharpen her strategies. The fear she had instilled in the household began to return to her in the form of unease, a subtle recognition that her previous dominance could no longer hold sway. In the quiet moments of the night, Ayana reflected on the transformation within herself. The fear that had once been her constant companion was now a tool she could wield, a reminder of what she had endured and what she could overcome. Her spirit had awakened fully, fueled by both suffering and the realization of her own latent power. She understood that vengeance, carefully planned and executed, could serve justice and restore balance without descending into cruelty. By the end of this turning point, Ayana had become a force that could no longer be ignored. Villagers and household members alike sensed her presence as something formidable yet measured. The girl who had once been silenced, humiliated, and beaten was now emerging as a figure of both fear and respect, a beacon of resilience whose spirit would not only survive but eventually transform the household that had sought to break her. Her awakening had begun, and the steps toward justice, cunning, and ultimate reclamation of her power were now irrevocably set in motion. The household awoke one morning to a quiet tension, a subtle unease that no one could immediately place. Ayana had been planning this day for weeks, weaving together every lesson learned from suffering, observation, and the secret skills she had honed in isolation. Her vengeance would not be brutal, for she knew that true power lies in restraint and cunning. Instead, it would be poetic, precise, and unforgettable, revealing the cruelty of her stepmother in a manner that left no room for denial or evasion. It began with small, seemingly innocuous disruptions. Tasks assigned by the stepmother were subtly sabotaged. Flour disappeared from the kitchens at critical moments, ink from ledgers smudged, and servants found minor but humiliating errors appearing in their work. Each act was carefully calculated to sow confusion and doubt, making the household question its own functioning. The stepmother, once the embodiment of order and fear, found herself increasingly bewildered. Her authority eroded not through violence but through the quiet intelligence of her oppressed stepdaughter. Ayana then orchestrated encounters that forced the household to witness the stepmother's true nature. Servants were guided to overhear her cruel insults, her manipulations, and her favoritism toward those who enabled her tyranny. The words, once hidden behind closed doors, now reached ears that had long been trained to ignore them. The whispers of truth spread like wildfire, igniting murmurs of discontent among the servants and even some of the stepmother's own allies. Each revelation was carefully timed, a chess move designed to leave the stepmother exposed while preserving Ayana's safety. One of the most striking maneuvers involved a banquet, where the stepmother intended to flaunt her control and dominance over the household. Ayana subtly redirected preparations. Dishes arrived imperfectly plated, servants appeared flustered yet unaccusably competent, and small mishaps occurred in full view of the visiting villagers and family friends. The stepmother's attempts to maintain composure only highlighted her temper and cruelty, leaving her increasingly flustered. Ayana, observing from the shadows, allowed a calm, assured smile to play upon her lips, knowing that the public eye was now witness to her stepmother's unraveling. As Ayana's plan unfolded, she revealed her most daring act, a carefully staged demonstration of the consequences of the stepmother's cruelty. She invited the household and select villagers to witness a lesson in humility. Using her keen observation, she highlighted how the stepmother's insistence on fear and punishment had sown distrust and incompetence among her own allies. Documents and household records, subtly rearranged by Ayana, revealed discrepancies, revealing her stepmother's mismanagement and favoritism. The household gasped as the pattern became undeniable, leaving the stepmother's allies no choice but to question their loyalties. Ayana's intelligence and strategic insight became increasingly apparent. Every move she made was a calculated exposure of the stepmother's cruelty, yet it carried the elegance of poetic justice rather than the harshness of revenge. Servants who had once cowered found courage in her presence, whispering support and cooperation in ways that amplified Ayana's influence. Even the stepmother's favored attendants began to recognize the wisdom in siding with the girl they had once dismissed as weak. Slowly the balance of power shifted. The stepmother, confronted with the undeniable truth, became increasingly desperate. Her attempts to lash out or reassert dominance only further revealed her instability. Ayana, however, remained composed, never allowing anger or triumph to cloud her judgment. Her vengeance was not born of cruelty but of clarity. It was meant to illuminate, to educate, and to correct, not merely to punish. Each revelation and act of sabotage was a reflection of the stepmother's own misdeeds, mirrored back to her in a way she could neither deny nor deflect. As the final pieces of the plan fell into place, the household erupted into upheaval. Allies turned against the stepmother, some quietly refusing to carry out her orders, others openly confronting her with the truths that Ayana had laid bare. The once feared matriarch was rendered powerless not by violence but by the quiet force of awareness and the clever orchestration of justice. Ayana's presence dominated the room, her intelligence, courage, and inner strength radiating with a subtle authority that left all who witnessed it in awe. By the evening, the stepmother was isolated, her influence shattered, and her cruelty publicly recognized. Ayana had orchestrated a victory that was as instructive as it was decisive. The household, shaken but liberated from the grip of fear, began to understand that strength does not always manifest as brute force. Sometimes, it lies in resilience, intelligence, and the ability to wield subtle power with precision. Through it all, Ayana remained calm, a testament to the power of the unbroken spirit. She had taken every act of cruelty, every insult, and every attempt at humiliation and transformed them into tools for justice. The story of her vengeance spread quietly among the villagers and servants, an enduring lesson that cunning, courage, and inner strength could overturn even the most oppressive of circumstances. The household would never forget the day when the girl who had been beaten and belittled revealed the depth of her wisdom, leaving her stepmother undone by the very environment she had sought to control. In the aftermath, Ayana's presence was no longer that of the timid girl who had cowered under oppression. She had become a figure of awe, a living example that true power often lies in strategy, patience, and the unwavering courage to reclaim one's dignity. Her vengeance had been poetic, measured, and just, a masterful display of intellect and inner strength that left a permanent mark on the household and the village alike. The village gathered in quiet anticipation, whispers carrying through the narrow streets like ripples across a still pond. News of Ayana's triumph over her stepmother had traveled far and wide, and today would be the day the reckoning was made public. The household, once cloaked in fear and the heavy hand of tyranny, now stood as the stage for a lesson that would resonate beyond its walls. Every villager, servant, and family member who had suffered under the stepmother's cruelty assembled to witness the outcome, their eyes fixed on the young girl who had once been oppressed, now transformed into a figure of authority and justice. Ayana approached with measured calm, her steps deliberate, exuding the quiet confidence of someone who had endured suffering yet emerged unbroken. She did not rush nor strike in anger. Her power lay not in intimidation but in the unwavering clarity of her purpose. The stepmother, once the household's unchallenged ruler, stood trembling at the center of the courtyard, her composure shattered, her allies shrinking back uncertainly. No amount of pleading or defiance could mask the truth. Her cruelty had been laid bare, and the court of the village had seen the evidence. Before any declaration, Ayana spoke softly, her voice carrying authority without need for harshness. She recounted the deeds of the stepmother, the daily torments, the manipulations, the fear imposed upon servants and family alike. Each word was precise, almost surgical, revealing the reality of the household to those who had once turned a blind eye. Yet in her recounting there was no bitterness. There was justice, tempered with understanding of human weakness and the consequences of choices made in greed or fear. The villagers murmured amongst themselves as the evidence unfolded, faces pale with recognition. Those who had enabled the stepmother's cruelty now realized their complicity, while those who had suffered silently felt the vindication of truth. Ayana allowed them to witness the consequences of tyranny, the stepmother's isolation, the crumbling of her support, and the undeniable supremacy of wisdom exercised with restraint. This was a lesson not only for the guilty but for the community itself, a reminder that oppression always carries within it the seeds of its undoing. When the moment came to deliver judgment, Ayana did not wield punishment as a weapon. The stepmother was stripped of her titles and privileges, her influence removed entirely, yet Ayana chose exile over execution. This act of mercy demonstrated that true justice is not vengeance disguised as cruelty but the measured restoration of balance. The stepmother, humbled and powerless, was led from the household, leaving behind a legacy of shame that would forever mark her actions. With the stepmother gone, Ayana turned to the household and the village, addressing them as one who had endured yet learned from suffering. She outlined a vision of fairness, compassion, and respect, a governance rooted in understanding rather than fear. She reminded them that true strength is not measured in dominance or coercion but in the ability to rise above cruelty while maintaining one's principles. The villagers listened, rapt, as a new order took shape around them, guided by the wisdom of someone who had experienced both oppression and empowerment. Ayana's restraint throughout the reckoning was a powerful statement in itself. She demonstrated that the difference between tyranny and authority lies not in the removal of obstacles but in the method of their removal. Her choices reflected her growth. She could have crushed her oppressor completely, yet she chose the path that emphasized justice, dignity, and learning. In doing so, she modeled the kind of leadership that inspires loyalty and respect rather than fear, a legacy far stronger than any fleeting display of power. By the day's end, the household had transformed entirely. Servants who had once cowered found confidence, family members who had been silent found voices, and the villagers carried away lessons about the value of courage and integrity. Ayana's presence radiated authority tempered with empathy, her stature no longer that of the vulnerable girl but of a formidable young woman whose spirit could not be broken. She had reclaimed her rightful place not through anger or cruelty but through wisdom, patience, and the strategic use of her inner strength. In the days that followed, stories of the reckoning spread throughout the village and neighboring communities. Ayana became a symbol, a living testament to resilience, intelligence, and measured power. The tale of her confrontation with her stepmother served as a guide for generations, a reminder that oppression can be overcome, that justice can be delivered with clarity and compassion, and that a spirit once challenged can emerge as a force of enduring strength. The household, now governed by principles of fairness and accountability, reflected the profound change brought by Ayana's leadership. Her stepmother's shadow no longer lingered, it had been replaced by the light of reason, courage, and strategic justice. Ayana's emergence as both wise and formidable marked the beginning of a new era, one where strength was measured not by the ability to dominate but by the capacity to empower, protect, and transform. The household, once cloaked in tension and dread, began to breathe under Ayana's presence. The walls that had echoed with whispers of fear now carried conversations tinged with respect and curiosity. Servants moved about their tasks with a quiet confidence, no longer fearful of arbitrary punishment or sharp words. Even the children of the household, once timid and wary, began to laugh and play openly, their voices no longer stifled by the shadow of cruelty. Ayana's influence radiated subtly at first, a nod to fairness here, a gentle correction there, but it was unmistakable. The air itself had shifted, and those who had lived in fear now sensed the presence of order guided by empathy rather than oppression. Outside the household, the village began to notice the changes as well. Word spread of Ayana's measured authority, and villagers who had once avoided the estate out of fear now approached with cautious trust. They saw that the household no longer ruled through intimidation, and in turn they responded with respect, cooperation, and a willingness to engage openly. The markets flourished as trade resumed smoothly, and neighbors who had been distant due to the household's harsh reputation found opportunities for reconciliation and dialogue. Ayana had not merely displaced fear with power, she had cultivated an environment where fairness and justice were expected, and people responded by stepping into their own sense of responsibility. Within the household, Ayana implemented small but profound changes that reflected her vision. Chores were assigned equitably, ensuring no individual bore a disproportionate burden. Disputes among servants and family members were mediated with impartiality, emphasizing understanding and restoration rather than punishment. Meals were shared communally, fostering a sense of connection previously absent under the stepmother's rule. These actions may have seemed minor to an outsider, but to those who had endured the weight of fear, each gesture was transformative. Trust grew where suspicion had thrived, and the once oppressive atmosphere gave way to one of mutual respect. Ayana's personal presence also became a symbol of resilience and dignity. She carried herself with quiet authority, never resorting to intimidation or dominance, yet her guidance was felt in every corner of the household. Family members who had previously attempted to manipulate or control her recognized her strength, and even the most defiant servants found that her decisions were fair and firm. Her ability to maintain order without fear inspired loyalty and commitment, demonstrating that true leadership arises not from coercion but from integrity and vision. As weeks turned into months, the household began to embody the transformation Ayana had instilled. The courtyard, once silent and tense, now rang with the sounds of cooperative work and laughter. Rooms that had held secrets and sorrow now held openness and dialogue. Even the garden, neglected under the stepmother's neglect, bloomed vibrantly, symbolizing the renewal of life and care under Ayana's guidance. Every corner of the estate reflected a shift from oppression to empowerment, a testament to the power of one individual's resilience to transform an entire environment. Beyond the walls, the village adjusted to the new order. Neighbors sought guidance from Ayana, inspired by her ability to balance firmness with compassion. Disputes between villagers were resolved with her mediation, and local markets thrived under her fair oversight. Her presence became a stabilizing force, bridging divides and encouraging cooperation. Where fear had once dictated behavior, respect and accountability now guided actions, reflecting the profound ripple effect of her influence. Ayana's leadership extended beyond the mere administration of the household. It reshaped the culture itself. The oppressive shadow that had long dominated the estate and its surroundings was replaced by a climate of trust, diligence, and mutual support. Her strength, born from a history of suffering, became the foundation upon which a fair and just environment was built. The household and village alike flourished under her guidance, demonstrating that resilience, wisdom, and moral courage can transform not only individuals but entire communities. Through her actions, Ayana proved that power exercised with fairness and empathy could replace fear with dignity. The once oppressed girl had become the guiding force of her household and village, showing that justice, respect, and integrity could reshape an environment previously ruled by cruelty. Her presence ensured that order was maintained not by intimidation but by the example of steadfast strength, leaving a lasting impact on all who lived within and around her domain. Years had passed since Ayana transformed her household and village, yet the echoes of her story persisted like a wind that could not be contained. Travelers from distant lands spoke in hushed tones of the girl who had endured relentless cruelty and emerged not only unbroken but triumphant. Villagers recounted tales of her intelligence, her strategic cunning, and the way she had overturned injustice with subtlety and grace. Mothers told their children of how Ayana had faced daily torment yet had refused to surrender her spirit, teaching them that true strength often emerges from patience, observation, and unwavering resilience. Ayana's name became synonymous with courage in the face of oppression. It was said that even the most formidable adversaries trembled at the thought of her keen mind and quiet determination. Stories told of her stepmother's schemes unraveling not through brute force but through clever interventions, of servants and family members rallying behind her as they witnessed the justice she quietly but inexorably brought to their home. Every tale emphasized the wisdom and composure that had allowed Ayana to reclaim her place in the household without resorting to cruelty, showing that true power lies in control of oneself as much as in action. The proverb inspired generations. They tried to crush her light, but it became a blaze they could not withstand. It was recited in marketplaces, whispered at village firesides, and taught in schools as a lesson in perseverance and moral courage. Children learned that oppression could be resisted not only with defiance but with intellect, patience, and strategic insight. Adults remembered her story when faced with tyranny or deceit, drawing strength from the example of a young girl who had turned suffering into empowerment. Her legend became a guide for living with dignity, resilience, and an unshakable sense of justice. Her influence extended far beyond her village. Neighboring regions spoke of Ayana's achievements, and leaders consulted her for guidance in resolving disputes or navigating conflicts with fairness. Her methods, balancing cleverness, empathy, and strength, became a blueprint for leadership that emphasized justice and moral authority over fear or intimidation. The household she had once transformed remained a model of harmony and equity, attracting visitors who wished to learn how one unbroken spirit could reshape an entire community. Even long after her passing, the essence of Ayana's character lingered in the collective memory. Her story was etched into songs, carvings, and oral histories, ensuring that every generation knew of the girl who had faced relentless hardship yet emerged as a beacon of intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance. The blaze of her spirit became a metaphor for inner fortitude, showing that when light is nurtured within, no attempt to extinguish it can ever succeed. Through her life and legacy, Ayana taught an enduring lesson. Suffering and oppression do not define the individual, the response to these challenges does. Her cleverness, patience, and unwavering resilience demonstrated that the human spirit, when tempered by wisdom and courage, can rise above any attempt at suppression. Communities across the land drew inspiration from her, finding in her story the confidence to resist injustice, protect the vulnerable, and wield their own power with integrity. Ultimately, Ayana's unbroken spirit became a symbol of hope and inspiration. Her legend ensured that no act of cruelty, no attempt at suppression, could overshadow the potential for justice, cunning, and moral strength. Her tale reminded all who heard it that resilience is not merely survival. It is the quiet, strategic, and determined transformation of adversity into a force that shapes the world. In this way, the blaze that her oppressors had hoped to extinguish became a guiding light, illuminating paths of courage, cleverness, and unwavering spirit for generations to come.